In 2011, a 19-year-old kid from Pittsburgh released an album out of his own pocket with no major label behind it, and it debuted at #1 on the Billboard chart. The first independent debut album to do that in 16 years. Then, 7 years later, the same guy was found dead in his own home at 26. This is the story of Mac Miller. And honestly, the more I researched this one, the more it stopped feeling like a story about drugs and started feeling like a story about what happens when the world decides who you are before you've decided for yourself. If you're new here, this is where we tell stories like this one. Real, no filter. So if that's your thing, subscribe now, because you're going to want to see how this one actually plays out. Let's start in Pittsburgh. Malcolm James McCormick is born on January 19, 1992, in the Point Breeze neighborhood of Pittsburgh. As a kid, he's the type who picks up instruments and just figures them out. Piano, guitar, drums, bass, mostly self-taught. By the time he's a teenager, he's already recording under the name Easy Mac, then later Mac Miller, putting out mixtapes for free online before putting out a mixtape for free online was even a normal thing to do. Here's the part that genuinely surprised me doing this. Mac Miller wasn't discovered. He built his own audience from nothing, mixtape by mixtape, while he was still in high school. By the time he graduated Taylor Alderdice High School in 2010, he already had a real loyal fan base. Not because a label pushed him, but because teenagers were passing his songs around like a secret they'd found first. He was doing, on his own laptop in his childhood bedroom, what a lot of artists needed an entire label machine behind them to pull off. In 2011, he self-releases his debut studio album, Blue Slide Park, named after a playground in his hometown park that he used to hang out at as a kid. It's a fun, loose, party rap record, and it does something almost nobody expected. It debuts at #1 on the Billboard 200. The last time an independently released debut album had done that was 1995. Mac Miller was 19 years old. And then something happens that a lot of people forget about now. The album gets absolutely torn apart by critics. Pitchfork, one of the most influential music outlets at the time, gives it a 1.0 out of 10, one of the lowest scores they'd ever handed out. Think about that for a second. A teenager achieves a commercial milestone almost no independent artist ever hits, and the response from serious music criticism is basically, this doesn't count, this isn't real. That gap between what the chart said and what the critics said followed him for years. What's genuinely admirable, looking back, is what he does with that gap. Instead of chasing the party rap sound that made him famous, Mac starts pushing in a completely different direction. Under a new alias, Larry Fisherman, he starts producing, experimenting, going weirder and more introspective with every project. Albums like Watching Movies with the Sound Off and later Faces trade the frat party energy for something darker, jazzier, more honest. Records where he's openly rapping about anxiety, drug use, self-doubt, the exact things a 19-year-old party rap star wasn't supposed to talk about. By the mid-2010s, critics who'd once dismissed him start walking it back. He's not just growing as an artist, he's actively rebuilding how people see him, one uncomfortable, honest record at a time. In 2016, Mac Miller begins a relationship with Ariana Grande, at the time, one of the biggest pop stars on the planet. And I want to be careful here, because so much of what gets said about this relationship online reduces both of them to a headline. But what's actually documented is this: the two of them collaborate creatively. They're publicly affectionate. And for a couple of years, Mac Miller, the guy Pitchfork once wrote off, is one half of one of pop culture's most visible couples. It doesn't last. In May of 2018, Mac is involved in a DUI incident. He crashes his car into a utility pole in the Hollywood Hills. A few weeks later, he and Ariana Grande split up. The public reaction to the breakup at the time wasn't kind to him. a lot of people online blamed him directly for it, using his struggles with substance use as the explanation, whether that was fair or not. It's worth sitting with that for a second. A man dealing with real, documented struggles becomes almost overnight a punchline in tabloid breakup coverage. That's not a great environment for anyone trying to get better. And then, this is the part that still gets me. 3 months after the breakup, Mac Miller releases what a lot of critics now consider the best album of his career, Swimming. It's raw, it's produced beautifully, and it's honest in a way his earlier work only gestured toward. Songs like Self-Care and 2009 don't hide the struggle behind clever wordplay the way some of his earlier work did. They just say it plainly. He talks openly in interviews around the album about therapy, about trying to get healthier, about being, in his words, in a great space. Rolling Stone calls it the most impactful album of his career. It's nominated for a Grammy. By every public account available at the time, Mac Miller looks like a guy who's turning a corner. He's set to start a tour behind Swimming in late October 2018. He never makes it there. On September 7th, 2018, Mac Miller is found unresponsive at his home in Studio City, California, by his personal assistant and sobriety coach. He's pronounced dead at the scene. He's 26 years old. We're not going to walk through the details of that morning. What's publicly known from the Los Angeles County Coroner's report released weeks later is this. The cause of death was ruled an accidental overdose involving a combination of fentanyl, cocaine, and alcohol. Fentanyl, a synthetic opioid so potent that even a tiny, almost invisible miscalculation in a street-bought substance can be fatal, is identified as the primary factor. It's a pattern that's become tragically common across the music industry in the years since. A lot of these deaths aren't people intentionally taking a fatal dose. They're people whose bodies simply couldn't survive what was actually in what they thought they were taking. The response is immediate and enormous. Hundreds of fans gather the same day at the Blue Slide Playground in Pittsburgh's Frick Park, the exact place that gave his debut album its name, leaving candles, flowers, handwritten notes. Fellow artists who'd worked with him, Chance the Rapper, Post Malone, Khalid, dozens of others, post about him within hours. And what's noticeable is how many of them don't talk about the music first. They talk about how kind he was, how he'd bring people up rather than push them down, in an industry that often does the opposite. 2 months later, Ariana Grande releases Thank You Next, a song that, among other things, includes a direct, tender lyric about him, calling him an angel. Whatever complicated feelings existed around their breakup, that line says something simple and true. She still loved him, and she was grieving him like everyone else was. In 2020, 2 years after his death, Mac Miller's family releases Circles, an album he'd already been working on before he died, intended as a companion piece to Swimming. It's not a posthumous cash grab stitched together from scraps. By most accounts, it's close to what he actually envisioned, finished carefully and respectfully by people who loved him. It's one of the most quietly devastating listens in his catalog. A man, weeks before his death, sounding more at peace with himself than he ever had publicly before. Here's what strikes me most, having gone through all of this. Mac Miller spent almost his entire public life being underestimated, as a corny white rapper, in his own words, as a tabloid footnote in someone else's relationship story, as a kid who got lucky once and got torn apart by critics for it. And the entire time, underneath all of that noise, he was quietly becoming one of the most respected, most technically gifted artists of his generation. A fact that most of the industry only fully admitted after he was already gone. That's the uncomfortable thread running through almost every story we tell on this channel. The recognition tends to arrive after it can't reach the person who earned it anymore. Mac Miller once said, in an interview years before his death, that overdosing wasn't cool, that there was no legendary romance in it, that you don't go down in history because you overdosed. You just die. He said it almost as a warning to himself. It's hard to watch that clip now and not feel the weight of it. If this story meant something to you, do me a favor. Hit subscribe and maybe go listen to Swimming or Circles all the way through today. Not the singles, the whole thing. That's probably the most honest way to actually get to know who he was. This was Undertone. One life, one truth.